Um, I forgot Clyde. Sorry, that wasn't intentional. 24th evening. Now listen to what the moon told me. Several years ago, here in Copenhagen, I looked in through the window of a poor furnished room. The father and mother slept, but their little son was not asleep. I saw the flowered cotton bed curtain move and the child peep out from behind it. At first, I thought he was looking at the great Bornholm clock, which was brightly painted in red and green with a cuckoo atop it and heavy lead weights hanging below. The pendulum, with its glittering brass plate, swung to and fro, tick-tock, but it wasn't the clock that the little fellow looked at. No, it was his mother's spinning wheel, which stood just beneath the clock. To him, this was the most precious thing in the entire house, yet he never dared touch it, unless he wished to have his fingers slapped. For hours he would sit beside his mother while she spun, looking at the humming spindle and circling the wheel, and at those moments he always had his own thoughts. Ah, if he only dared to turn the spinning wheel by himself. His father and mother still slept. He looked at them first, then at the spinning wheel. Presently a little bare foot stuck out of the bed, then another bare foot, and soon two small legs appeared. And bumps! Then he was standing on the floor. Once more he turned around to see if his father and mother slept. Yes, they did, and then dressed only in his short little shirt. He stole very, very softly to the spinning wheel and began to spin. The thread flew off, but the wheel only turned the more quickly. I kissed his yellow hair and his light blue eyes. It was a pretty picture. Suddenly his mother awoke. The bed curtains moved. She peeped out and instantly thought of goblins or little sprites. "In Jesus' name," she said, and in her fright she nudged her husband. He opened his eyes, rubbed them with his hand, and looked at the busy little fellow. "Why," he said, "that is Bertel." My eyes turned from the humble room. I have so many things to see, you know. And in the same instant I was looking down into the halls of the Vatican, where stand the marble statues of the gods. I lighted up the Laocoon group, and the stones seemed to sigh. I pressed my silent kiss on the breast of the Muses, and they seemed to come to life, but my rays rested longest on the Nile group, on the colossal figure of a god. There he lay, leaning on the Sphinx, dreaming, thoughtful, as if he were thinking of 3 years gone by. Around him the little cupids played with the crocodiles. A tiny little cupid sat in the horn of plenty, his arms crossed, and gazed at the stern and mighty river god, a true picture of the little boy at the spinning wheel with the very same features. Here, lifelike and charming, stood the little marble child, and yet the wheel of time has revolved more than 1,000 times since it was cut out of the stone, and it would have to revolve again as many times as the boy turned the spinning wheel in the humble room, before the world would once more produce marble figures like these. Many years have since passed, the moon continued. Only yesterday I looked down on a bay on the eastern coast of Zealand, surrounded with high banks and beautiful forest. There is an old manor house there, with red walls and swans on the waters of the moat, while nearby is a pretty little country town with its church situated among the apple orchards. A great many boats, lighted with torches, glided over the calm surface of the water. The torches had not been lighted for catching eel. No, this was a festival. Music sounded and a song was sung. In one of the boats stood the man who was the object of this homage, a tall, powerful figure wrapped in a great cloak, a man with blue eyes and long white socks. I knew him, and I thought of the Nile group and the marble statues of the gods in the Vatican. And I thought of that humble little room. I believe it was in Grand Street, where the little Bertel, in his short little shirt, sat and spun. The wheel of time has turned, and new gods have been carved in marble. From the boats aroused shouts. "Hurrah, hurrah for Bertel Thorvaldsen." 25th evening. "I'll give you a picture from Frankfurt," said the moon. "I noticed one building in particular there. It was not the birthplace of Goethe, Nor was it the old town hall through whose grated windows one may still see the horned skulls of oxen that were roasted and given to the people at the coronation of the emperors. The building was a burgher's type of house, plain and painted green, and stood at the corner of the narrow Jew's alley. It was the house of the Rothschild. I looked in at the open door. The staircase was brightly lighted, servants in livery with wax tapers and massive silver candlesticks bowed low before an aged woman who was being carried down the stairs in a chair. The master of the house stood by, bareheaded, and pressed a respectful kiss on the old lady's hand. She was his mother. She nodded kindly to him and to the servants, who then carried her through the dark, narrow street and into the little house. Here she lived, and here she had borne all her children. From the spot their great fortunes had blossomed forth. Were she now to leave the miserable street and the little house, perhaps fortune would abandon them. That was her belief. The moon told no more. His visit to me that evening was all too short, but I thought about the old lady in the narrow, miserable street. A single word from her, and she could have had a magnificent house on the bank of the Thames. One word from her, and she could have had a villa on the Bay of Naples. If I should desert the humble house from which the fortunes of my son have sprung, then perhaps fortune might desert them. This was a superstition, but one that, to those who know the story and have seen the picture, 2 words of postscript will give full meaning. A mother. 26th evening. It was yesterday morning at dawn. These are the moon's own words. And I was looking at the chimneys of a large city from which as yet no smoke arose. Suddenly a little head popped up from one of them, and half the body followed, and both arms rested on the edge of the chimney. Hurrah! It was a little chimney sweep, who, for the first time in his life, had climbed to the very top of a chimney and stuck his head out. Hurrah! Yes, this was indeed very different from the creeping about in the narrow flues and little chimneys. The air was so fresh, and he could look out over the whole city to the greenwoods. The sun was rising. It shone round and large into his face, which beamed with joy and was prettily blacked with soot. The whole city can see me now, he said. The moon can see me, and the sun too. Hurrah! And then he waved his broom above his head. 27th evening. Last night I looked down on a city in China, said the moon. My beam shone on the long bare walls that formed its streets. Here and there was a door, of course, but it was always shut, for what has a Chinese to do with the world outside? Tight bonds concealed the windows behind the walls. Only from within the temple was there a light which shone faintly through its windows. I looked in and observed in colorful grandeur. From floor to ceiling the walls are painted with many pictures, in vivid colors and rich gilt, representing the actions of the gods on earth. In every niche is the statue of a deity, almost entirely concealed by colored draperies and hanging banners. Before each of the gods, they are all made of tin. There's a little altar with flowers, holy water, and burning candles. But foremost in the temple was Fu, the principal deity, clad in a silken robe of the sacred color yellow. At the foot of his altar sat a living figure, a young priest seemingly lost in prayer, but in the midst of his prayers he seemed to fall into a deep reverie. He must have had some sinful thought on his conscience, for his cheeks burned and his head was bent to the ground. Poor Sohong! Could he perhaps be dreaming of working in his little bed of flowers, one such as separates every Chinese house from the long street wall? And was that work more agreeable to him than sweeping the temple and snuffing wax tapers? Or did he long to be seated at the richly laden table, wiping his lips with silver paper between courses? Or was his sin so great that if he dared confess it, the celestial empire would punish him with death? Or were his thoughts bold enough to follow the barbarian ships to their home in distant England? No, his thoughts did not wander so far, and yet they were as sinful as the hot passions of youth could make them. Doubly sinful in the temple here in the presence of Fu and the other holy gods. I know where his thoughts were. In the outskirts of the city, upon a flat, flagged roof, where railings seemed to be of porcelain and where there were beautiful vases with large white bellflowers, sat the beautiful Pe, with her small roguish eyes, full lips, and the tiniest feet. The shoes pained her feet, but in her there was still greater pain, and the satin rustled as she raised her delicate round arms. Before her was a glass globe with 4 goldfish. With the many-colored varnished stick, she stirred the water. Oh, so slowly, for she was lost in thought. Perhaps she was thinking how richly clothed in gold the fish were, how safely they lived in the glass bowl, how generously they were supplied with food, and yet how much happier they would have been free. Her thoughts roamed far away from her home. Her thoughts wandered to the temple, but it was not with homage for the gods. Poor Pei, poor Su Hong, their earthly thoughts met, but my cold beam lay between them like the sword of an angel. 28th evening. The ocean was calm, said the moon. The water was as transparent as the clear air through which I sailed. Deep down beneath the surface of the waves, I could see the strange plants that stretched up their long stalks like great forest trees, while the fishes played above the tops of them. High in the air flew a flock of wild swans. One of them, whose wings were exhausted, sank lower and lower, while its eyes followed the aerial caravan disappearing in the distance. It kept its wings spread wide and sank as a soap bubble sinks in the still air, until at last it touched the surface of the water. Its head bent backwards between its wings, and it lay there motionless like the white lotus flower on the peaceful lake. A breeze arose, fanning the quiet surface of the water, which gleamed and rippled until it curled up in large white-capped waves. Then the swan raised its head, and the shiny water splashed like blue fire over its breast and back. The dawn of day touched the clouds with red. With new strength, the swan arose and flew toward the rising sun, toward the bluish coast. The way the aerial caravan had gone before, but the swan flew alone, with longing in its breast. In loneliness, it flew over the swelling waves. 29th evening. I'll give you another picture from Sweden, said the moon. Between dark pine forests, near the dreary banks of Lake Roxen, is the old convent church of Vreda. My rays penetrated through the grating in the wall into the spacious vault where the kings sleep in huge stone coffins. A kingly crown, symbol of earthly pomp, shines on the moldering wall above, but it is made of wood, painted and gilded, and hung on a wooden peg driven into the wall. The worm has eaten into the gilded wood, while the spider has spun its web from the crown to the coffin like a mourning veil, and it is as frail as sorrow for the departed often is. How peacefully they sleep. I can remember them quite well. I can still see the proud smiles on their lips, from which came mighty and decisive pronouncements that brought joy or sorrow. When the steamboat winds its course among the mountains like a magic bark, a stranger frequently makes a pilgrimage to that church and visits the burial vault. He asks the name of the kings, but they sound unfamiliar and empty to him. He smiles at the worm-eaten crowns, and if he happens to be of pious nature, there is a sadness reflected in its smile. Slumber on, ye dead. The moon still remembers you, and by night sends cold rays into your silent kingdom, where the pine-wood crown hangs. 30th evening. Close by the highway, said the moon, stands an inn, and opposite it is a large wagon shed, the roof of which was being thatched. I looked down between the rafters and through the open loft shutters into the dismal shed. The turkey cock was asleep on a beam, and a saddle lay in the empty manger. In the middle of the shed stood a traveling coach in which the travelers were napping in easy security, while the horses were being watered and the coachman was stretching his legs. I well know that he had spent more than half the journey sleeping comfortably. The door to the servants' room was open. The bed was all topsy-turvy, and on the floor stood a candle that had burned deep into the socket of the candlestick. The wind blew coldly through the shed. The time was closer to dawn than to midnight. In one of the side stalls slept a family of poor wandering musicians. The father and mother were probably dreaming of the burning drops left in their bottle, while the pale little girl was dreaming of the burning tears in her eyes. At their head lay their harp, and at their feet their dog. 31st evening. It occurred in a little provincial town, said the moon. It was last year that I saw it, but that doesn't matter, for I saw it very clearly. Tonight I read about it in the newspaper, but there it was not nearly so clearly told. The owner of a dancing bear was tied up behind the woodpile in the yard. The poor bear that looked so fierce but did nobody any harm. Up in the attic room, 3 small children were playing by the light of my rays. The oldest was perhaps 6, the youngest not more than 2. Tramp, tramp. There was somebody coming up the stairs. Who could it be? The floor flew open. It was the bear, the huge shaggy bear. He had tired of waiting so long out of the yard and had found his way up the stairs. I saw it all, said the moon. The children were terribly frightened of the great shaggy animal, and each ran to hide himself in a corner. The bear found all 3 of them and put his snuffling muzzle up to them, but he didn't harm them. This must be a big dog, thought the children, and they began to pet him. The bear stretched out at full length on the floor. The youngest boy rolled over to him, and putting his curly head in his beast's shaggy black fur, began to play hide and seek. Then the eldest boy brought his drum and thumped away on it with might and main, whereupon the bear promptly stood erect on his hind legs and began to dance. What a charming sight! Each boy shouldered a musket, and of course the bear had to have one too, which he held onto firmly. What a playmate they had found! And away they marched, 1, 2, 1, 2. Suddenly the door opened and the children's mother appeared. You should have seen her speechless with horror, her face white as a sheet, her mouth half open, her eyes glassy with terror. But the smallest boy nodded to her with a great delight and cried out childishly, "Mama, we're only playing soldier." And then the bear's owner appeared. 32nd evening. The wind was stormy and cold. The clouds flew swiftly by. Only for a moment at a time could I see the moon. I looked down through the silent sky at the drifting clouds, he said. I see the great shadows chase across the earth. Recently I looked down on a prison outside of which stood a closed carriage waiting to take a prisoner away. My rays went in through the barred window to the wall where the prisoner was scratching lines as parting memento. He was not writing words, but a melody, the outpourings of his heart, on his last night in this prison. Then the door opened and he was led outside. He looked up at my round face. Clouds drifted between us as if he should not see my face, nor I his. He entered the carriage. The door was closed. The whip cracked, and the horses galloped off into the deep forest where my rays could not follow him. But as I glanced again through the barred window, my rays fell on the melody scratched on the wall, his last farewell. Where words fail, often music can speak. My beams could light up only a few of the notes, so that most of what was written there will forever dark to me. Was it a song of death that he wrote? Or were these notes of joy? Was he driving away to meet his death or to the embrace of his beloved? The rays of the moon do not read all that mortals write. I look down through the great silent sky at the drifting clouds. I see the great shadows chase across the earth. 33rd evening. I am very fond of children, said the moon, especially the little ones who are so amusing. When they are not thinking of me at all, I peep into the room between the curtain and the window frame. I like to watch them dressing and undressing. First the round, naked little shoulder comes creeping out of the frock, and then the arm slides out. Or else I watch the stocking being drawn off, and a sweet little leg, so white and firm, appears with the little white foot that is to be kissed, and I kiss it too. This evening, and this I must tell you, this evening I looked through a window where there was no curtain drawn, for nobody lived opposite. I saw a whole flock of youngsters, brothers and sisters. Among them was a little girl. She is only 4 years old, but she can say the Lord's Prayer as well as any of the others. And every evening the mother sits beside her bed and listens to her pray. Then she gets a kiss, and the mother remains there until the child falls asleep, which happens as soon as she closes her little eyes. This evening the 2 elder children were a bit wild. One of them danced about on one leg in his long white nightgown, while the other stood on a chair with all the children's clothes were and announced he was posing for Greek statues. The 3rd and 4th put their toys carefully away in the drawer, for that has to be done. Then the mother sat by the bed of the youngest and ordered the rest to be quiet, for their little sister was going to say the Lord's Prayer. I peeped in over the lamp, said the moon. The 4-year-old girl lay in her bed between the neat white linen, her small hands folded and her little face was very serious. She was saying the Lord's Prayer out loud. "Why is it," said her mother, interrupting her in the middle of the prayer, "that when you've said, 'Give us this day our daily bread,' you always add something else that I can't quite understand? What is it? You must tell me." "Mother dear, please don't be angry," I only said. "With plenty of butter in it."